I want to begin, my dear, in a solicitor's office on a grey afternoon 2 weeks after I buried my husband. The whole family was crammed into that little room, my son Geoffrey at the front, leaning forward, a notepad on his knee, actually a notepad, my dear, ready to write down his inheritance. And the solicitor, a kind, quiet man called Mr. Pembroke, read out the first page of my husband's will. And Geoffrey's face was a picture of satisfaction, because the first page said more or less what he'd expected and planned his life around. And then Mr. Pembroke turned the paper over, and he cleared his throat, and he said, "There is a second page," and I watched my son's smile freeze on his face. Because Geoffrey did not know there was a second page. Nobody knew there was a second page, except my husband and me and Mr. Pembroke. And what was written on it, my dear, undid in 90 seconds, 15 years of a grasping man's assumptions. But to understand page 2, you must first understand the quiet man who wrote it, and the 2 very different children he raised, and the long, slow illness that showed us at last exactly who everybody really was. My name is Brenda, and I am 80 years old, and I live in a stone cottage in a village in Lancashire, where I have lived for most of my long life. For 53 years I was married to my husband, Stanley Stan. Everyone called him, though never Stanley. He hated Stanley. Stan was a joiner, my dear, a maker of things, a man who could turn a rough plank into something beautiful, and he was without question the quietest man I have ever known. He was not cold, never that, but he was still and watchful, and he kept his own counsel. He'd sit in his chair of an evening and say barely a word, but those grey eyes of his missed nothing, my dear, nothing at all. People mistook his quietness for simplicity. They thought because Stan didn't say much that there wasn't much going on. Oh, my dear, they could not have been more wrong. There was a very great deal going on behind those quiet grey eyes. Stan was always watching, always weighing, always quietly taking the measure of people. He just very rarely told you what he'd concluded. He told you in the end through the things he made, and through the things he did, and as it turned out, through page 2. Let me give you one example of how my Stan saw the world, my dear, because it tells you everything. Years ago, a neighbour came round wanting a garden gate made, and he was a flashy sort, all promises, and he haggled Stan down to almost nothing, and then, when the beautiful gate was hung, found a dozen reasons not to pay the full agreed price. Stan said not one word of complaint. He simply took his payment, whatever the man chose to give, and said thank you. A year later, when that same man came back wanting a whole set of fitted bookcases, with money to spend this time, Stan said very mildly that he was rather too busy just now, and he was too busy for that man for the rest of his life. He never argued, he never made a scene. He just quietly noticed who a person was and adjusted accordingly, and never made the mistake of trusting them twice. That was my husband in everything, my dear. He didn't rage at the world. He just watched it very carefully and remembered and acted on what he'd learned when the time came, usually when you'd long forgotten he'd been paying attention at all. I should have known he'd do the same with his own children. I rather think Geoffrey should have known it too. We had 2 children, my dear. Geoffrey the elder and Susan the younger, and they could not have been more different if they'd been strangers. Geoffrey was the clever one, the ambitious one, the one who got on. He went off to the city, made good money in something to do with property, married a sharp woman called Marina, and acquired all the trappings, the big house, the German cars, the holidays he was always telling you about. And from about the age of 30, my dear, Geoffrey rather stopped seeing us as his parents and started seeing us, I came to understand, as an asset. An inheritance in waiting. He'd visit perhaps twice a year, and the visits always had a quality to them, a sort of inspecting quality. He'd cast his eye over the cottage, over Stan's workshop, over the garden, and you could almost see him valuing it, the way you'd value a property you expected to come into. He never asked Stan about his work. He never sat with him. He'd arrive, do his duty, drop a comment about how this place must be worth a fair bit now, and leave. That was Geoffrey. And then there was Susan. My Susan was not clever in the way Geoffrey was clever, and she never had 2 pennies to rub together, my dear. She'd had a hard time of it, a marriage that failed, a job that didn't pay much, a little terraced house she struggled to keep. But Susan, my dear, Susan came. Every single week, all those years, Susan came, and she didn't come to inspect anything or value anything. She came because she loved her mum and dad. She'd sit with Stan in his workshop for hours, the 2 of them barely talking, her just keeping him company while he worked, handing him his tools. And Stan loved those afternoons more than anything in the world, though being Stan, he never said so. She brought us soup when we were poorly. She drove me to my appointments. She remembered every year the anniversary of the day Stan's own father had died, and would ring him just to say she was thinking of him, and Stan, my dear, that quiet man, would put the phone down after those calls and have to go and stand in the garden for a minute. Susan asked for nothing. She had nothing, and she asked for nothing, and she gave everything. That was Susan. Now, my dear, I want to be fair because life is never quite as tidy as a story. Jeffrey was not a monster. He was not cruel. He was simply a man whose heart had been quietly colonized by money until he could no longer tell the difference between people who loved him and assets that would one day be his. And I think, for many years, Stan and I assumed we'd do the ordinary, fair thing, split everything down the middle between the two children, the way most parents do because that's what's fair, isn't it? Equal shares. We had a will that said exactly that, drawn up years before, and it might have stayed that way, my dear, and there'd have been no story to tell if it hadn't been for Stan's long illness. Because the illness, my dear, is where everybody showed their true colours, and once your true colours are shown, they cannot be unshown. Stan was ill for the last 3 years of his life. It was a slow thing, a wearing down thing, the kind that takes a strong, capable man and shrinks him by inches, which for a maker of things, a man whose whole self was in his hands, was a particular cruelty. And during those 3 years, my dear, we found out exactly what each of our children was made of. Susan, of course, was there, more than ever. She rearranged her whole hard-pressed life around her father's decline. She'd come on her days off and sit with him so I could rest. She learned how to help him with things a proud man hates needing help with, and she did it so gently, so matter-of-factly, that she never once let him feel diminished. When he could no longer go out to his beloved workshop, she'd wheel him to the doorway of it so he could at least sit and smell the wood and the sawdust, and she'd describe to him what wanted doing out there, and the two of them would plan jobs he'd never do, just for the pleasure of planning them. There is one afternoon from those years that I shall carry with me always, my dear. Stan had had a bad night, and was low, and ashamed of needing help to wash and dress, the way proud men are when their bodies betray them, and Susan came, and she saw how it was, and instead of fussing, she said, "Right, Dad, I've got a job for you. I can't for the life of me work out how to fix the sticking drawer in my kitchen, and you're the only one who'd know." And she sat him by the workshop door with a cup of tea, and she fetched the drawer she'd deliberately brought, and the broken old man, who an hour before had been weeping with the shame of needing help to button his shirt, spent a happy afternoon directing his daughter on how to ease a sticking drawer, telling her where to sand and how much, his eyes bright again, a maker of things once more instead of a patient. She'd brought a broken drawer 4 hours in the car, my dear, not because it was broken, I suspect she broke it herself on purpose, but because she understood that what her father needed was not to be helped, but to be useful. That is a kind of love that cannot be taught, my dear. You either have it in you or you don't. Susan had it. That, my dear, is love, not grand, not loud. Just there every single day doing the small unglamorous things. And Jeffrey, when we told Jeffrey his father was seriously ill, that the time was growing short, do you know what my son's response was, my dear? He was sorry to hear it, of course, said all the right words. And then within a few months he began to raise, with increasing frequency, the subject of getting things in order. The will, the house, whether we'd thought about care, home fees eating into the estate, whether it might be sensible to sign the house over to him now to protect it. He came to visit his dying father perhaps 4 times in 3 years, my dear, 4 times, and on at least 2 of those visits, he found a moment to talk to me quietly about the inheritance. Once I caught him in the workshop, not looking at his father's tools with any love or memory, but photographing them on his telephone, valuing them. His father was dying in the next room and Jeffrey was taking an inventory. And his wife Marina actually asked me at one point, with Stan still very much alive upstairs, whether the rocking horse, a beautiful thing Stan had made by hand for the grandchildren, was the sort of thing that might be worth something at auction. I have never forgotten the way she said it, my dear, casually, while she helped me dry the dishes, as though she were asking about the weather. That rocking horse, my dear, Stan made it the winter Jeffrey himself was born, 50 years before. He carved its mane by hand, and painted its eyes so kind that every child who ever sat on it loved it, and Jeffrey himself had ridden it, and so had Susan, and so had all the grandchildren. And his daughter-in-law looked at it and saw a lot number. I said I shouldn't think so, Marina, it's only sentimental, and I dried the next plate and I said nothing more, but something hardened in me that day, and I think it was the same thing that had already hardened in Stan. Because there is a particular coldness, my dear, in a person who can stand in a dying man's house and see only what it might fetch. It is not loud, that coldness. It does the dishes and asks about auctions, but once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Stan, my dear, in his quiet way, saw all of it. That was the thing about my husband that people forgot. He was ill and he was failing, and he said very little, and so everyone behaved around him as though he were already gone, as though a quiet dying man wasn't really taking anything in. But Stan took it all in. Those grey eyes, even at the end, missed nothing. He saw which child wheeled him to the workshop door, and which child photographed his tools. He saw who held his hand, and who measured his house. He didn't say much about it, he wouldn't, that wasn't his way. But one afternoon, about 6 months before he passed, when it was just the two of us, he said to me very quietly, "Brenda, I want to change the will, and I want to do it properly, and I want it kept between us. Will you fetch Mr. Pembroke?" And I knew exactly why, and I did not argue because I had seen everything he had seen, so we changed it. Stan and Mr. Pembroke and I, in that quiet workshop, with Stan too weak to hold a chisel but his mind sharp as the day I married him. And Stan dictated a second page. And then he went back to being his quiet self, and he never breathed a word of it to a soul. And 6 months later he died peacefully in his own bed, with my hand in one of his and Susan's hand in the other. And Geoffrey, my dear, 3 hours' drive away, who did not quite make it in time, though he made it in time for the funeral. Oh yes, and in very good time for the solicitor's office. The funeral itself told its own story, my dear, if anyone had been watching the way Stan watched. Susan wept like her heart had broken, because it had. Geoffrey gave a very polished eulogy about what a self-made man his father had been, and somehow made it sound as though the making had been mostly Geoffrey's doing. And no sooner was the coffin in the ground, I am not exaggerating, my dear, the soil was barely on it, than Geoffrey had his arm round me, steering me gently away, murmuring about how we'd need to sort out the practicalities soon, and how he'd had a word with an estate agent already, just to know where we stand. Already. He'd had a word with an estate agent already. His father's grave was still open, and my son had already valued the cottage I was standing in my widow's weeds beside. That, my dear, is the moment I knew with absolute certainty that Stan had done exactly the right thing. And so we come to the solicitor's office. 2 weeks later, the whole family squeezed in, Geoffrey and Marina at the front, Geoffrey with his notepad, honestly his notepad, my dear. Susan at the back, who had not thought about the will once, who had only come because Mr. Pembroke had asked her to, and who looked faintly ill at the whole business of it. And Mr. Pembroke read page 1. And page 1 was the old will, more or less the estate to be divided. And I watched Geoffrey relax and nod, and even begin to write something on his wretched notepad, a man tallying his winnings. And then Mr. Pembroke turned the page and said those words, "There is a second page." A codicil dated some 6 months before Mr. Ainsworth passed, being a revision to his wishes, and accompanied by a letter he asked me to read aloud. And the room went very still. I will tell you what page 2 said, my dear, for I helped him write it, and I know it by heart. It said that the cottage and the bulk of Stan's savings, for the frugal old joiner had rather more put by than Geoffrey, for all his valuing, had ever bothered to find out, were left to me, his wife, for my lifetime, and thereafter in their entirety to our daughter Susan. Not divided, to Susan. And to our son Geoffrey, page 2 left 3 things. It left him the sum of £1. It left him the set of carpentry tools he had photographed but never once asked his father to teach him to use. And it left him a letter. And Mr. Pembroke read the letter, my dear, in his quiet, steady voice, while Geoffrey sat frozen with his notepad on his knee. Geoffrey, the letter said, "You will be angry, and I am sorry for that, but you are owed the truth plainly, the way I never could say it out loud. I leave you £1 so that you cannot say I forgot you. I did not forget you. I thought about you a great deal. I leave you my tools because I always hoped, right to the end, that one day you'd want to learn what your hands were for, beyond signing papers and counting other people's houses. And I leave you this letter so you'll understand. Son, an inheritance is not a wage you are owed for being born. It is the last thing a man has to give, and a man gives his last things to the people who gave him theirs. Your sister gave me her time, her company, and her love freely for nothing, expecting nothing when I was a frightened old man dying by inches. You gave me a notepad and an estate agent. I watched you photograph my tools while I lay dying, son. I watched, I always watched. You spent 15 years valuing what I had. Susan spent 15 years valuing who I was. Page 2 is simply me at the very end doing the same, with love which you never believed I had much of, but which I had, and have even now, even for you, your dad. I want you to picture that room as the letter was read, my dear, because I have never seen the truth land on faces quite like it. Mr. Pembroke read in his quiet, even voice, never hurrying, never softening, just letting Stan's plain words fall one after another into that silent room. And I watched Geoffrey's face go through everything a face can go through. The satisfaction first, then puzzlement, then a dawning disbelief, then a flush of pure outrage. And then right at the end, at the words which you never believed I had much of, but which I had, and have even now, even for you, I watched something else cross my son's face, just for a second before the anger slammed back down over it. It was grief, my dear. Real grief, because in those final words he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that his quiet father had loved him all along, had been watching him all along, had wanted something from him all along, not money, never money, but a son who'd sit in the workshop, and that he had been too busy valuing the house to ever once give it. That is a terrible thing to learn in a solicitor's office 2 weeks too late. I would not wish it on anyone, and yet, my dear, I have come to think it was the kindest thing Stan ever did for him, that terrible gift of the truth, because nothing gentler had ever got through. The silence in that office, my dear, I shall never forget. Geoffrey went white, and then red, and he blustered, and he spoke of contesting it and lawyers and his father's state of mind, but Mr. Pembroke, calm as you like, observed that Stan had been independently assessed as entirely of sound mind at the time, that the codicil was watertight, and that the letter, frankly, would not help any challenge Geoffrey cared to bring. And Susan, my dear, Susan was not triumphant. That is the thing I want you to understand. Susan burst into tears, and turned to her brother, and said, "Jeff, I don't want the house, we can sort it out, we can split it, I never wanted." Because Susan, who had every right to that house, would have given it away in a heartbeat to keep the peace, which is precisely, my dear, precisely why her father left it to her. The one who'd have given it away was the one who deserved to have it. That is not an accident. That is the whole of the lesson, wrapped up in a weeping woman in the back row of a solicitor's office. Geoffrey left in a fury, and for a time he did not speak to us, and I grieved that, my dear, I did, for he is still my son and I love him still, the way you love a child who has lost his way. But here is the strange and hopeful thing, and it is true, and I would not tell it if it weren't. The will that Geoffrey thought had robbed him turned out in the end to be the only thing that ever reached him. Because somewhere in that bitter year that followed, alone with that £1 and that letter and those unused tools, my son finally read what his father had actually written, not the money part but the love part. I always hoped you'd want to learn what your hands were for. And about 18 months after the funeral, my dear, Geoffrey turned up at my door without Marina, looking older and quieter, and he asked me, haltingly, like a boy, whether I still had his father's workbench, and whether I thought it was too late for a man of 50 to learn to use a chisel. And he has been learning, my dear. Badly, slowly, with a great many ruined planks. But every ruined plank is my son at last, trying to become the kind of man his father hoped he might be. The first thing he ever finished, and it took him the best part of a year, and it was crooked, and the joints didn't quite meet, was a little stool. And he brought it to show me, this man of 50-odd, holding up his wonky little stool like a boy bringing home a painting from school. And he said, "It's rubbish, isn't it, Mum?" And I said, "It's the most beautiful thing I've seen in years." And I meant it with my whole heart, because I was not looking at the stool, my dear. I was looking at my son. And I'll tell you something else that mended slowly. Susan and Geoffrey, who had grown so far apart, began to talk again. For Susan, true to herself, never lorded the house over him. And in the end she did share some of it with him, freely of her own choosing, once he had become a brother worth sharing with. Which is the loveliest joke of all, my dear. In trying to grasp the whole house, Geoffrey lost it. And in giving up all claim to it, Susan ended up giving him a piece anyway. The money found its way to roughly where Fair would have put it in the first place, but it had to go the long way round through the truth to get there, and it changed everyone it passed through on the journey. Stan reached him in death in a way he never managed in life. Page 2 did that. Now here is the lesson, my dear, and it is a clear one. Money shows people exactly who they are, and a deathbed and will show them most sharply of all. There is no truer test of a person than how they behave around an inheritance they think is coming, whether they spend the last precious years valuing what you have, or valuing who you are. And I want to say gently to anyone listening who has elderly parents, be a Susan. Not because of what's in the will, Susan never gave the will a thought, and that was exactly her grace. But because the years when they are failing and frightened are the last years you will ever have them, and they are worth more than any house. Sit in the workshop, hold the hand, give your time, which is the only inheritance that runs both ways, and do not, my dear, I beg you, be the one photographing the tools. And to the older ones among us, the ones who, like my Stan, are quietly watching and weighing and saying little, I'd say this. You see more than they think you see. They behave around you as though your quietness were blindness, but it is not, and you know it is not. You are under no obligation, my dear, to leave your last things to people who valued only your things. Fair is not the same as equal. It is perfectly just, and sometimes it is the last true thing you can do, to give your last gifts to the ones who actually showed up. Stan understood that. He kept his counsel his whole quiet life, and then he said everything all at once on page 2, and it turned out the quietest man any of us ever knew had been keeping the sharpest eyes in the room, right to the very end. So love the old ones for themselves, my dear, while you still have them, and never let money tell you who to be. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Go and ring your mum or your dad if you're lucky enough to still have them, not about anything, just to say you're thinking of them. It meant more to my Stan than any inheritance ever could. And if there is a quiet one in your family, A stan, a watcher, someone who says little and you've fallen into the habit of talking over, go and sit with them a while, and ask them what they think, and then be quiet long enough to hear the answer. The quiet ones, my dear, are very often the ones who see the most clearly, and have been waiting the longest for somebody to ask. Good night and God bless, and mind how you go.